He thought humiliating her would be easy, but in less than 5 minutes, his entire career would begin to unravel in front of his own students. And the worst part was, he would realize too late that the quiet woman he mocked was the only person in the room who truly understood the problem he built his reputation on. The lecture hall at Westbridge University buzzed with anticipation as over 200 students filled the tiered seats, the polished wooden floors reflecting the sharp white lights. Above, while notebooks, tablets, and whispered conversations created a low hum of expectation, at the center stood Dr. Jonathan Reeves, a celebrated mathematician known as much for his brilliance as for his intolerance toward anyone he deemed unqualified. His tailored navy suit and confident posture commanding attention as he turned toward the massive chalkboard filled with complex symbols that few in the room could fully grasp. This was his signature lecture, the one that had earned him grants, recognition, and a reputation that stretched across academic circles nationwide. And as his eyes scanned the audience, they paused briefly on a figure in the back row, a woman who didn't belong, or at least, that's what everyone assumed. Clara Whitmore sat quietly, her gray sweater slightly worn at the sleeves, her dark hair pulled back in a simple tie. No designer bag, no polished laptop, just a small notebook resting on her lap. She had entered the hall unnoticed, slipping into her seat while others compared internships and research papers. But there was something in her gaze, steady, observant, as if she wasn't just listening, she was measuring. Around her, whispers began to ripple. Is she auditing? Someone muttered. Maybe staff. Another suggested with a faint smirk. No one considered the possibility that she might be there for the same reason as everyone else, to understand, to challenge, to see beyond the surface. Dr. Reeves turned back to the board, tapping a section of the equation with deliberate emphasis. This, he announced, is where most people fail. His voice carried authority, sharp and precise. This transformation separates theoretical understanding from true mastery. A few students nodded eagerly. Others scribbled notes they barely comprehended. And then, almost imperceptibly, Clara tilted her head, her fingers tightening slightly around her pen as something didn't align. Not quite. Not perfectly. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the cost of speaking in a room that had already decided who she was. But then, quietly, almost too soft to notice, she raised her hand, the movement subtle yet undeniable, and for a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Reeves noticed. Of course he did, his gaze sharpening as it landed on her. And in that instant, something shifted, not in her, but in him, because to him, she wasn't a student. She was an interruption, and interruptions were something he never tolerated, especially not from someone who looked like they didn't belong. And that was the moment he made his decision. The moment he chose to turn curiosity into humiliation, unaware that he had just stepped into a mistake that would silence not just him, but the entire room. Dr. Jonathan Reeves allowed the silence to stretch just long enough for the entire room to notice where his attention had landed. Then he adjusted his glasses and let out a faint, almost amused breath before speaking, his voice smooth but edged with something sharper beneath. Well, this should be interesting, he said, his gaze fixed on Clara as if she were a curiosity rather than a participant. You have a question, or are you just following along? A few students chuckled quietly, the kind of restrained laughter that came more from permission than humor. Clara lowered her hand slightly, but did not look away, her voice calm, steady. I was wondering about the transformation in the third step, she said. The boundary conditions do not seem consistent with the substitution you used. The words were precise, careful, but they landed heavier than anyone expected. The laughter faded, replaced by a subtle shift in posture across the room. Dr. Reeves paused, not because he was unsure, but because he was deciding how to respond. And then, slowly, a smile formed, not one of encouragement, but of opportunity. He stepped away from the board, folding his arms as he looked at her more directly now. And what is your name? He asked. Clara Whitmore, she replied. In your department? Clara hesitated for just a fraction of a second. I am not enrolled in a program, she answered. I am attending independently. That was all it took. A ripple of whispers moved through the seats. Not enrolled, someone murmured. Just auditing. Another added under their breath. Dr. Reeves nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already decided. I see, he said, and yet you feel comfortable questioning advanced theoretical work presented at this level. His tone carried a polite surface, but beneath it was unmistakable condescension. Clara did not respond immediately, and in that silence, the imbalance in the room grew more pronounced. "I was only asking for clarification," she said finally, her voice still even. Dr. Reeves turned back to the board, tapping the equation. Again with the end of the chalk. "Clarification," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Then perhaps you would be kind enough to provide that clarification for all of us." The room shifted again. Students straightened, some leaned forward, others exchanged quick glances. Sensing what was coming next, Dr. Reeves stepped aside and gestured toward the front. "Since you have identified a potential inconsistency, why do not you come up here and show us the correct approach?" he said, his voice now carrying across the entire hall. The invitation was not an invitation at all. It was a challenge, and everyone knew it. A few students smiled openly now. Anticipation building. Phones subtly lifted beneath desks, ready to capture the moment. Clara remained still for a second, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her notebook, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, not fear, but calculation. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. The expectation, the quiet assumption that she would hesitate, that she would decline, that she would confirm exactly what they already believed about her. Dr. Reeves tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for the inevitable refusal. "Unless, of course, you would prefer to return to your seat," he added, his voice almost generous now. Though the underlying message was clear, "This is not your place." The room grew still, the air tightening with that familiar tension before something breaks. And then, Clara closed her notebook, stood up, and said quietly, "I will try." And in that moment, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but real, because the woman they thought they understood had just stepped into a space none of them were prepared for, and the room, without realizing it yet, had begun to change. Clara walked to the front of the room, her footsteps echoing across the polished floor, a soft, almost imperceptible rhythm. But in that silence, it felt as though every eye in the room was watching her, waiting for her to falter, to shrink back into the quiet woman they thought she was. She reached the chalkboard and paused for a brief second, her fingers lightly brushing the surface, feeling the cold texture beneath her fingertips. She glanced at the equation, her gaze steady, as though she were already several steps ahead, not just understanding the problem, but seeing the path, the solution unfolding before her eyes. Dr. Reeves, still standing off to the side, watched her closely, his arms folded, a small, knowing smile still on his lips, convinced that this would be the moment he would prove her inadequacy to the room. But Clara was already in motion, her hand moving with purpose, drawing lines, making notations, and her chalk leaving clear, deliberate marks on the board. The room was completely silent now. Not even the faintest rustle of paper or shuffle of feet could be heard. It was as if time itself had slowed down, the air thick with expectation. Clara's movements were fluid, effortless, as she erased a section of the equation and rewrote it with a precision that made Dr. Reeves' earlier work look incomplete, as if the missing piece had always been right there in front of him, waiting to be discovered. She didn't hesitate as she continued, solving the equation with an ease that was almost unnerving. Dr. Reeves' smile faded, his eyes narrowing as he watched her, his mind racing as he tried to follow her every move, but finding himself unable to catch up. It wasn't just that Clara was solving the equation. It was how she was solving it, how she approached it with a quiet confidence that seemed to cut through the complexity, making it look like something that could be understood by anyone willing to look at it the right way. As she reached the final step, Clara paused again, her hand hovering over the board as she double-checked her work. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft scratch of the chalk as she finished the final line, the last piece falling into place, and then, without a word, she stepped back. Dr. Reeves didn't move for a long moment, his gaze locked on the board, his mind processing what had just happened. He scanned the equation, his eyes flicking from one line to the next, searching for a mistake, a flaw, something, anything that could discredit her work, but it was perfect. There were no errors, no inconsistencies. Clara had done it. The room remained silent as the realization hit him. The confidence that had once been so sure and commanding now seemed fragile, shaken by the quiet woman who had just demonstrated a level of understanding he had failed to see. The students, who had once eagerly anticipated her failure, now sat frozen, unsure of what to do, how to react. Dr. Reeves opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words never came. He looked at Clara, his face pale, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Clara stood there, her back straight, her eyes calm, a quiet sense of accomplishment in her expression. She hadn't done this for validation, nor to prove anyone wrong, but simply because she understood the problem, and it had been that simple. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Reeves took a step back, his voice low and unsteady. "Well, it seems you've proven me wrong," he muttered, but there was no real pride in his tone, no recognition of the talent that had just been displayed before him. Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply gave him a small, measured smile, one that acknowledged his words, but also spoke volumes about the power of quiet strength. She turned and walked back to her seat, leaving Dr. Reeves standing there, speechless, while the room remained eerily still, the weight of the moment settling over everyone, and Clara knew, without a doubt, that she had just changed everything. As Clara returned to her seat, the room seemed to hold its breath. The students, once eager to watch her fail, now sat frozen, unsure of what to think, how to react. The silence stretched on, almost oppressive. Dr. Reeves, standing off to the side, remained motionless for a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the board where Clara had just demonstrated the solution, a solution so flawless, so precise, that it shattered the illusion of his own invincibility. He tried to shake the unease creeping up on him, but it lingered, thickening in the air like a fog that refused to lift. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice shaky, the confidence he had carried for years now nothing more than a memory. I'll have to review your work more thoroughly," he muttered, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was an empty gesture. There was nothing to review. Clara had done it. It was done. The truth was staring him in the face, and there was no way to deny it. For the first time, the students in the room shifted in their seats, murmuring among themselves, their earlier mockery replaced by a new, uncomfortable respect. They were no longer looking at Clara as the quiet woman at the back of the room. She had become something else, something they could not ignore, something they would have to reckon with. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat, but the sound only seemed to emphasize the weight of his failure. He straightened, trying to regain some semblance of authority, but it was too late. The room had already changed, and Clara had changed it. "Perhaps we should move on," he said, the words falling flat. He turned toward the next problem on the board, but his mind was elsewhere. Clara Whitmore had walked into his class as an outsider, a quiet, unassuming presence who had, in a matter of minutes, turned his world upside down. And now, as he continued with the lecture, he could feel the eyes of the students on him, watching, waiting for him to recover, to regain control of the room. But all he could think about was Clara, and how, in the quietest way possible, she had humbled him. As the minutes passed, Clara sat silently, her gaze fixed ahead, her expression calm, but in her mind, she was already beyond this moment. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It never had been. She hadn't done this for validation or to get back at anyone. She had simply solved a problem, the same way she had done countless times before. She understood the equation, and she had made it make sense. For her, that was enough. The rest, Dr. Reeves, the students, the expectations, were all just noise. She had shown them something they weren't ready to see, but it wasn't her responsibility to fix their perceptions. Clara knew that some battles weren't about fighting at all. They were about quietly doing what others thought was impossible and letting the truth speak for itself. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but the energy in the room remained charged, as if everyone was waiting for something else to happen, for someone to break the silence that had settled so heavily over them. As the students began to pack up, Clara stood, her movements fluid and graceful, and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Clara had already said everything that needed to be said. The next day, Clara entered the university courtyard, her steps measured, calm, as she made her way to the coffee stand she frequented. The sounds of bustling students and the faint hum of distant conversations filled the air, But Clara remained in her own quiet space, her mind still processing the events of the day before. It wasn't that she had expected any recognition or praise. She hadn't done it for them. But she knew, deep down, that something had shifted, and there was no going back from it. She ordered her usual, the barista smiling at her as she handed over the cup, but Clara didn't engage in the small talk that usually accompanied the routine. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the way the room had felt after the lecture ended, how it had felt to leave without a single word from Dr. Reeves or any of the students who had watched her. She didn't need anyone to speak for her. Her actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. As she sipped the warm coffee, Clara's mind wandered back to the equation she had solved the day before, the clarity with which it had all clicked together, and how, in a room full of so many brilliant minds, she had still managed to surprise them all. That was the beauty of it. Her brilliance had never been about showing off or competing. It had always been quiet, almost hidden, something that existed inside of her, waiting for the right moment to surface. And yesterday had been that moment. She wasn't sure what Dr. Reeves would do with this new understanding of her. He hadn't acknowledged it in class, had barely even looked at her after she finished. She wondered if he would even remember her name in the weeks to come, or if she would just become another quiet student whose talent went unnoticed. But Clara was okay with that. She wasn't in this for the validation. What mattered to her was knowing that she had solved the problem, that she had proved to herself, and to anyone who was paying attention, that brilliance didn't always need a stage to shine. As she sat down at one of the benches in the courtyard, a few students passed by, and one of them, a familiar face from the previous day, glanced over at her, a look of recognition flickering in their eyes. It was brief, but it was there. Clara smiled to herself, not out of arrogance, but because she understood something now that she hadn't fully grasped before. She didn't need their acknowledgement to feel fulfilled. She had already done the work. She had already shown her worth. The rest was just noise. As the campus continued to move around her, Clara felt a quiet satisfaction wash over her. She had claimed this moment for herself, not by demanding it, but by simply being who she was, quiet, thoughtful, and capable of things no one had expected. And that, she realized, was enough. The following week, Clara returned to her usual routine, her steps steady, the quiet confidence she had gained from the previous days now ingrained in every movement. She had come to realize that the silence after the lecture was its own kind of victory. It had been a reflection of something deeper, her ability to break through the assumptions people had of her, to stand in a room full of experts and quietly show them that sometimes the loudest impact came from the quietest person. Yet, as the days passed, she could feel a subtle shift in the air. Students who had once dismissed her now gave her a wider berth. Their glances lingered just a moment too long. Their conversations hushed as she walked past. She didn't mind. The attention didn't interest her. What mattered was that she had earned their respect, without demanding it, and without even trying. It was a quiet power, but a power nonetheless. As she walked into the coffee shop one morning, Clara noticed a familiar face among the usual crowd of students. It was the same student who had watched her with curiosity during the lecture, the one who had seemed unsure whether to laugh or to be impressed. He caught her eye this time and gave a small, hesitant smile. Clara returned the smile, but didn't stop to engage. It wasn't a need to prove anything to him, or to anyone else, that drove her. She simply moved through her day, as always, focused on the work she enjoyed, the challenges that brought her satisfaction. She sat down by the window with her coffee and pulled out a notebook, opening to the page where she had written the equation from Dr. Reeves' class, the one that had started it all. She could still see the problem clearly in her mind, the elegant solution she had found so easily, the way it had come together in front of her. And though she hadn't expected it, there was a small sense of pride in knowing that the puzzle she had solved had not just been academic. It had been a demonstration of her ability to rise above the expectations others had of her, to show them that talent doesn't always wear the face they expect. As the weeks went on, Dr. Reeves continued to teach his lectures, but there was something different now, something in the way he moved through the room, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on Clara for a fraction longer than before. She didn't dwell on it. She knew that the respect he had for her, if it ever came, would not be spoken directly, nor would it be shown in grand gestures. It would be in the quiet acknowledgement of her capabilities, and that, Clara realized, was enough. She had already proven what she needed to prove. It was not the validation from others that she sought, but the satisfaction of knowing her own worth, a satisfaction that, no matter how much the world might doubt her, could never be taken away. The sun streamed through the windows of the coffee shop, casting warm light across her open notebook. Clara smiled, a soft, private smile, knowing that her journey had only just begun, and the road ahead was hers to walk with quiet confidence, one step at a time. Weeks passed, and the campus settled back into its usual rhythm, but something had shifted, and Clara could feel it. She had never craved the spotlight, but now, she couldn't help but notice the subtle change in the way people looked at her. The same students who once whispered behind her back now nodded in passing, their gazes no longer dismissive but rather filled with a quiet acknowledgement. Even Dr. Reeves, who had barely spoken to her since that day, seemed to watch her with a new, measured interest. His lectures were as sharp as ever, his authority unchallenged in front of the class, but there was an unspoken respect now, and Clara felt it. She wasn't sure if he would ever say it aloud, but she didn't need him to. She had already proven everything that mattered. One afternoon, as she sat in the university's library, absorbed in her work, Clara overheard a conversation between two students at the nearby table. Their voices were low but carried clearly enough for her to catch every word. "Have you heard about Clara Whitmore?" one of them asked. "The one from Dr. Reeves' class?" The other responded, her voice tinged with awe. "Yeah, apparently she solved that impossible equation. They say Dr. Reeves was shocked. I heard he still can't figure out how she did it." Clara kept her head down, her fingers running across the pages of her notebook as she tried to focus on her own work, but the words lingered in her mind. She had heard similar murmurs from other students in passing, whispers of admiration, even curiosity. It was strange to hear her name spoken like that, but at the same time, it felt like a quiet affirmation of what she already knew. She didn't need anyone's validation to know her worth. Still, there was something about these small shifts that made her wonder about the power of perception. How quickly it could change, how easily people could overlook someone, only to suddenly recognize them when they least expected it. Clara had always known that her worth wasn't defined by the opinions of others, but she couldn't help but wonder if Dr. Reeves ever truly understood her. He had given her the challenge, but had he seen what lay beneath her quiet demeanor, beneath her reserved nature? Or had he simply been too blinded by his own expectations to see her for who she really was? It didn't matter, Clara decided. His recognition, or lack thereof, was not what would define her. What mattered was her ability to stay true to herself, to continue pursuing her passions, regardless of whether or not anyone else acknowledged her achievements. That afternoon, as she gathered her things to leave, she passed by Dr. Reeves in the hallway. He was walking with a colleague, engaged in conversation, but as Clara approached, he glanced over and nodded in her direction, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture. It wasn't much, but Clara saw it for what it was, a recognition. Not the loud, grand kind, but the kind that came from understanding, from knowing that she had earned a place in the world he once considered his own exclusive domain. Clara smiled to herself, a quiet, content smile. She wasn't interested in proving herself anymore. She had already done that. What mattered now was that she knew who she was, and that was enough. Months passed, and the campus began to feel like home to Clara, the subtle shift in how others viewed her now woven into the fabric of her daily life. She no longer walked the hallways unnoticed. Students greeted her with nods, some even seeking her out to ask for help with coursework. It wasn't that she had changed, it was that they had begun to see her for who she truly was, not the quiet woman they once assumed had nothing to offer. Clara continued to focus on her studies, her passion for learning undiminished by the attention or lack thereof. But there were moments when she couldn't help but notice the lingering glances, the occasional conversation that paused when she entered the room. She had become a quiet presence, one that commanded respect without asking for it. One day, as she sat in the university cafe, reading through a journal article, she overheard a conversation between two students at the next table. "Do you think Clara Whitmore is as brilliant as they say?" one of them asked. The other hesitated for a moment before responding. "I don't know. She doesn't seem like the type to want to stand out. But after that day in Dr. Reeves' class, I think she's something else. I've never seen someone solve a problem so effortlessly." Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't turn to acknowledge them. It wasn't about their opinions or whether they saw her brilliance. It was the fact that they had seen her, and that was enough. She knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. Her mind wandered back to the day in Dr. Reeves' class when she had solved that impossible equation, when she had shown not only her understanding of the problem, but also her quiet strength, the strength to stand in front of a room full of doubters and prove them wrong without uttering a single word. It was a strength she had always had, one that didn't require validation or recognition. She had done it for herself. Later that afternoon, as Clara walked through the campus, she passed by Dr. Reeves' office. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated for a moment before walking past. She knew he had likely noticed the change in her, but part of her wondered if he would ever truly understand what had happened that day. It wasn't just about solving an equation. It was about showing the world that there was more to her than they could see. Clara had once walked into that classroom as an underdog, underestimated and overlooked, but now she was someone to be respected, not because of her talent, but because she had quietly proven it to herself first. She had earned her place in the world, and that was all she needed. As she made her way to the library to continue her studies, she passed a group of students who were discussing the upcoming final exams. One of them, a young woman Clara didn't recognize, looked up and smiled at her. "Hey, Clara," she said, "I've been meaning to ask you for some help with the math problem in the textbook. You're really good at this stuff, right?" Clara smiled softly, nodding. "Sure," she said, "I'd be happy to help." In that moment, as she walked alongside the student, she realized something. She wasn't just the quiet woman in the back of the room anymore. She was the one others looked to for answers, for guidance. It was a role she had never sought, but one she had earned through the quiet power of being herself, of letting her abilities speak for her when the world had doubted her. Clara had always known she was capable, but now, others knew it too. As the semester drew to a close, Clara felt a sense of calm she hadn't experienced in a long time. The weight of the expectations others had placed on her no longer felt heavy. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had already achieved what mattered most, proving to herself that she was capable of more than even she had realized. The exams were approaching, and the campus buzzed with the usual stress and anticipation. But Clara wasn't worried. She had been studying diligently, as she always had, but now it felt different. There was no pressure to be perfect or to impress anyone. She was doing it for herself, and that made all the difference. One afternoon, as she sat in the campus courtyard, reviewing notes, she overheard a conversation between two students nearby. "I heard Clara Whitmore is top of the class," one of them said. "Yeah, she solved that impossible equation, remember? I bet she's going to ace the final," the other replied. Clara smiled to herself, not because of the praise, but because it wasn't something she needed anymore. She had already proven herself in ways that mattered far more than the opinions of others. She wasn't the quiet woman who had walked into Dr. Reeves' class months ago. She was someone different now, not because of the recognition, but because she had learned to trust herself, to embrace her abilities without needing validation. The final exam day arrived, and Clara walked into the lecture hall with the same quiet focus she had carried all semester. The other students seemed tense, flipping through notes and whispering to each other, but Clara remained calm. She knew the material, and she knew her own strengths. When the exam started, she worked through the problems methodically, not rushing but taking her time to ensure she understood each question fully. Her mind moved through the equations with the same ease and confidence that had led her to solve that impossible problem months before. She didn't worry about time or the students around her. It wasn't a competition. It was simply about doing the best she could, and that was enough. As the exam came to an end, Clara stood up and handed in her paper, her mind already shifting back to the work she loved. She didn't wait for others to finish. She didn't need to. It wasn't about being the fastest or the best in the eyes of others. It was about knowing she had given her best effort. Walking out of the lecture hall, Clara felt a sense of peace. She had proven to herself that she could do anything she set her mind to, and in that moment, she realized that nothing else mattered. She had already won, not in the eyes of others, but in her own heart. The world could think whatever it wanted, but Clara knew the truth. She had found her place, and it wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. It was her own, built on quiet confidence, unwavering strength, and the knowledge that she was enough, just as she was. The days following the final exam passed in a blur, with Clara slipping back into the familiar routine of quiet mornings in the library and peaceful afternoons in the coffee shop. Her mind settled after the weight of the exams had been lifted. The campus, however, seemed to be in constant motion. Students rushed between classes, preparing for the end of the semester, while Clara found herself walking at her own pace, no longer influenced by the frantic energy around her. One morning, as Clara sat by the window of the campus cafe, sipping her coffee, she spotted Dr. Reeves across the room. He was sitting at a table with a group of faculty members, engaged in conversation, but his eyes briefly met hers. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement, but he quickly looked away, returning to his discussion. Clara didn't mind. She had already proven herself. His recognition, if it ever came, was no longer something she sought. What mattered was that she knew who she was, and that had been enough to carry her through. The semester was winding down, and Clara began to prepare for the break. She had already secured a place for the next semester, but this time, it felt different. There was a shift in her, a sense of accomplishment that wasn't tied to any particular achievement, but to the quiet realization that she was in control of her own path. She wasn't waiting for others to see her worth. She knew it herself. As the final days of the semester came and went, Clara found herself walking across the campus, her footsteps light and unhurried. The world around her seemed to move at a faster pace, but she was no longer concerned with keeping up. She had done what she needed to do. She had proven, not to anyone else, but to herself, that she was capable of more than anyone had given her credit for. Clara knew now that there was no need to rush. She had earned her place, and she had earned it quietly, without fanfare, without seeking validation from anyone. The world would continue to move, people would continue to make assumptions, but Clara would always know the truth. She had found her own strength, her own voice, and it had been enough. As she walked into the library one last time before the break, Clara paused for a moment, taking in the familiar surroundings, the quiet, the stillness. She realized that this, too, was her space. She didn't need to be loud to be heard. She didn't need to fight for attention to make an impact. She had already done that. And now, as she sat down to continue her work, she smiled to herself, content with the knowledge that she had already achieved everything she needed to achieve. The rest of the world would catch up in its own time. As the break approached, Clara found herself in a quiet rhythm, one that no longer felt defined by external measures. The campus was alive with the hustle and bustle of students packing up, preparing for time away from the demanding schedules of university life. Yet, Clara felt at ease, as though the pressure to perform had dissolved into the peaceful certainty that she had already achieved what she set out to do. She had never expected to be noticed, to have her talents recognized by others. It had never been about their approval. The quiet confidence she had gained wasn't something that could be taken away by fleeting moments of validation. It was hers to keep. One afternoon, as Clara sat in the campus cafe, reading through a research paper, a familiar face approached her. It was the same student who had asked her for help with a math problem a few weeks ago. "Hey Clara," the student greeted her. "I just wanted to thank you again for your help with that problem. I ended up acing the exam. You really saved me." Clara looked up from her paper, offering a gentle smile. "I'm glad it helped," she replied, "but you did the work. I just pointed you in the right direction." The student smiled back, but Clara could tell there was more they wanted to say. "You know," the student continued, "everyone's been talking about you. About how you solved that impossible problem in Dr. Reeves' class. He was pretty shaken up about it, actually." Clara nodded, but didn't respond right away. She wasn't surprised by the whispers, but she didn't feel the need to engage in them. What mattered now wasn't the praise or the rumors. It was that she had found peace with who she was. "Anyway," the student said, "I just wanted you to know that you've made a real impact around here. People look at you differently now." Clara took a deep breath and gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I wasn't trying to make an impact. I was just doing what I knew how to do." The student seemed to understand and nodded in return before walking away. As Clara sat back, the weight of their words lingered, but not in the way she expected. She wasn't bothered by the attention. She realized, for the first time, that the recognition wasn't the part she valued most. It was the quiet understanding that she had made a difference on her own terms. She had always believed that success didn't have to be loud, that it didn't need to come with applause. It was about the satisfaction of knowing you had done the work, that you had done it well, and that the only validation you needed was from within. As the semester came to a close and the campus emptied out, Clara found herself walking down the familiar paths, no longer feeling like an outsider, but someone who had found her place among the crowd. The world around her was moving forward, and so was she, with the same quiet strength, the same calm certainty. And for the first time, she realized that everything she had worked for had led her here, to this moment of quiet accomplishment, where she didn't need anything from anyone else but her own belief in herself. As Clara prepared to leave campus for the break, there was a calmness about her that felt different from before. She had always carried herself with a quiet strength, but now, it was as if the weight of uncertainty had been lifted, leaving her with nothing but a quiet sense of accomplishment. The whispers around her, the recognition from her peers, and the brief but meaningful moments with Dr. Reeves had all contributed to a sense of self-assurance that she hadn't realized she was lacking. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to prove anything. The validation she had sought earlier had come, but it came not from the applause of others, but from the steady knowledge that she had done the work, that she had earned her place. As she walked across the campus one last time before leaving, Clara couldn't help but notice how different the world felt now. The same students that had once ignored her or written her off now nodded at her in passing, offering respectful smiles. It wasn't that she had changed, but that they had begun to see her for who she truly was. Still, Clara didn't need to acknowledge the shift. She had never cared for the spotlight, and the recognition, while appreciated, didn't define her. What mattered was the growth she had achieved on her own. As she sat on the bus heading home for the break, Clara reflected on everything she had learned. The experience had been about so much more than solving a difficult problem or earning a good grade. It had been about discovering the strength that lay within herself, a strength that had always been there, quietly waiting to be acknowledged. She thought about the first day she had stepped into Dr. Reeves' class, unsure of how she would fit in, unsure of how she would be seen. Back then, the idea of standing up and challenging someone like Dr. Reeves had felt impossible. But now, she realized that the act of standing up for herself, of trusting in her abilities, had been the key to everything. It wasn't about competing with others or meeting their expectations. It was about listening to herself, trusting her instincts, and knowing that she was enough. When she arrived home, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The break was a time for rest, but it was also a time for reflection. She knew that when she returned to campus, she wouldn't be the same person who had walked in at the start of the semester. She had grown, not just academically, but personally, and that was something no one could take away from her. Clara knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she also knew that she was ready for them. With her newfound confidence, she felt a quiet excitement for the future, not because it held any guarantees, but because she knew that, whatever came her way, she was capable of facing it with the same calm strength she had discovered within herself. As the days of the break passed, Clara took time to relax, to enjoy the simple things, and to reconnect with the parts of herself that didn't need to prove anything to anyone. When the time came to return to campus, she walked back through the gates with the same steady pace, ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had already accomplished everything she needed to accomplish. The rest of the world would catch up in its own time. As the new semester began, Clara walked across the campus once again, but this time, she did so with a renewed sense of purpose. It was as if the world around her had shifted in a way that made everything seem clearer, more certain. She no longer worried about fitting in or measuring up to the expectations of others. The quiet confidence that had grown within her was now a steady presence, grounding her as she moved through each day. The students she passed still greeted her with nods, some even exchanging small words of encouragement, but Clara no longer needed their validation. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate it. It was simply that she no longer relied on it to feel secure in who she was. It had become clear to her that the only approval she needed was her own. As the days went by, Clara continued to excel in her studies, but there was a new ease to her work. She approached each assignment not with the anxiety of needing to prove herself, but with the satisfaction of knowing that she was capable, that she had already done the hardest part. The rest of it was simply a matter of showing up, of doing the work, and of trusting herself to handle whatever challenges came her way. Dr. Reeves, too, seemed to notice the shift. While he never directly acknowledged the change, Clara couldn't help but sense the subtle respect in his gaze when he passed her in the hallway. It was the same quiet acknowledgement she had earned from her peers, a recognition that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She had already proven herself, and now, the world was simply catching up to what she already knew. One afternoon, as Clara sat in the library, immersed in her studies, she overheard a conversation nearby. "Clara Whitmore?" one student asked. "Yeah, I've heard she's the one who solved that equation in Dr. Reeves' class last semester. I think he still remembers it." Clara smiled softly to herself, but didn't turn to acknowledge them. She had heard these kinds of things before, but now, they no longer affected her. The praise was nice, but it wasn't necessary. She knew what she had accomplished, and that was enough. As she left the library that evening, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. The world continued to move around her, but she felt no rush to keep up with it. She had already found her pace, a pace that was hers and hers alone. She wasn't competing with anyone, and she wasn't waiting for anyone to notice her. She was simply living her life, doing the things that brought her fulfillment, and trusting that the right things would come in time. When Clara sat down that night to reflect on everything that had happened, she realized how far she had come. The woman who had once walked into Dr. Reeves' class uncertain and unsure had transformed into someone who understood her own worth, someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. And in that realization, Clara found the peace she had been searching for all along. The future was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was ready for whatever came next, because she knew that, no matter what, she would be enough.